Now that you're done with Super Mario Bros. Wonder, it's time to hit the streets with a completely different pair of siblings, Billy and Jimmy Lee. That's right, the Double Dragon Collection will be coming to the PlayStation, Xbox, and Switch on November 9th. This hotly anticipated compilation will feature the Nintendo Entertainment System versions of Double Dragon 2, The Revenge, and Double Dragon 3, The Sacred Stones, as well as Super Double Dragon on the Super Nintendo, Double Dragon Advance on the Game Boy Advance, and the awful Double Dragon 4 that came out in 2017. Honestly, that sounds like an exciting collection, but I still need to ask, are any of these games actually worth playing? To answer that question, I decided to flip through the pages of Electronic Gaming Monthly, Mean Machines, GamePro, and more classic magazines to see what the critics said back when these games first came out. It's time to put those sibling rivalries aside because this is going to be a fist-pumping episode of Double Dragon Review Crew.
Tiger puts arcade action in the palm of your hand. Games like Double Dragon 2. Billy Lee returns as you use your incredible ninja acrobatics to fight your way through 9 missions to defeat the ultimate villain, the Black Shadow Boss. Also available, Jordan vs. Bird, Al Unser Racing, Hang On, and Space Harrier 2. Tiger LCD video games. Video excitement in the palm of your hand.
While it wasn't the first beat-em-up to roundhouse kick the arcades, Double Dragon is definitely the one that everybody remembers. First released as a coin-op cabinet in 1987, and then on the Nintendo Entertainment System 1 year later, this was the world's introduction to Billy and Jimmy Lee, a pair of fist-fighting brothers who would not only go on to star in numerous sequels and spin-offs, but even get their own Hollywood movie in 1994. This was a massive game at the time, and all eyes were on the various home console ports, especially the one for the Nintendo Entertainment System. Let's see if the critics felt that the NES version lived up to the high watermark left by the arcade original. Now, believe it or not, Double Dragon was one of Electronic Gaming Monthly's earliest reviews, coming at a time before they adapted the recognizable 10-point scale. They not only gave the brawler the highest score they had, a direct hit, but they also named Double Dragon the best video game of the year for 1988. J. Moon concluded that it's a superb game, but it does have some shortcomings. A more appropriate name might have been Single Dragon, since the home version, unlike the arcade classic, only allows one player on the screen at a time. Don't, by any means, let this detour from what is otherwise an incredible gaming masterpiece. There are more screens than in the arcade, as well as vertical scrolling and the one-on-one matches that are very reminiscent of Karate Champ. My hat's off to Trade West for the remarkable job they did on Double Dragon. This is a game that is worth every penny. Now, don't expect any Game of the Year awards to come from the British press, who are not as enthusiastic about Double Dragon as EGM. Computer and video games, for example, could only muster up a score of 83% in their 86th issue. Rays liked it a bit more, but not enough to pair the right picture with the review, giving it an 89% and using an image of ghouls and ghosts. Rays argued that Double Dragon is preferable to Bad Dudes, even though the UK cart conversion means that you get a screen flicker every time the play area scrolls. Good fighting scenes are enhanced by some hilarious maneuvers, like grabbing your opponent by the hair and kneeing him in the face. Nice subtle move. Great definition and animation of character and objects make it worthy of Ray's reader purchase. While Rays may have recommended it, Nintendo Magazine System seemed a little bit more hesitant, giving Double Dragon a score of 75%. The lowest score I could find came from Mean Machines, who gave it a 72%. Graphically, this isn't outstanding. The sprites are small, and the backgrounds aren't exactly tops. The sound isn't great either, being rather weedy and unmemorable. But even though the cosmetics are average, the game does supply some pretty enjoyable beat-em-up action. However, when it comes to the bottom line, you're better off buying Double Dragon 2, which is better looking and a lot more fun. Well now, hang on, Mr. Mean Machines, we'll get to the sequel in a minute. While far from perfect, this Nintendo Entertainment System port was still pretty good, giving us a cool 2-player versus mode when they couldn't make the co-op gameplay work. That's quick thinking. It might not be my favorite game of 1988, but Double Dragon is still a great game that is worth playing. The original Double Dragon is without a doubt one of the most influential arcade games of all time. That said, I would argue that the Nintendo Entertainment System sequel, Double Dragon 2: The Revenge, is a substantially better game. It tells a cinematic story that is spread across a number of incredibly creative stages, all designed to push the Nintendo Entertainment System to the limits. And you know what? It works! Because this is, at least in my opinion, the franchise's high water mark. But let's go ahead and see if the critics agree with my full-throated endorsement of Double Dragon 2. Based on the reviews over at Electronic Gaming Monthly, the critics definitely agreed with me. Ed called it every bit as good, and even better than the first. New moves, new screens, new graphics, excellent player control, and multiple difficulty levels. Double Dragon 2 is easily the best kick-and-punch game ever made. Once again, Jim is here to back Ed up. Double Dragon 2 represents a phenomenal improvement over the original Double Dragon. The graphics, gameplay, and 2-player interaction all combined to blow Double Dragon out of my NES. EGM gave the sequel an average score of 8 out of 10. On the other side of the coin, we have Video Games and Computer Entertainment, who gave Double Dragon 2 the lowest score that I could find, a 6 out of 10. If at first you succeed, you do a sequel. This seems to be the motto of movie makers, and more recently, of game makers. Double Dragon 2 is the sequel to Double Dragon. It retains the strong points of the original, but improves on it in many ways. It is, by my way of thinking, a successful sequel. That said, they ended up complaining about the challenging stages and that the frustrating obstacles can sometimes lead to deaths that are outside of your control. Now, across the pond, we saw Double Dragon 2: The Revenge earn high scores from the British critics. For example, Nintendo Magazine System ended up going as high as an 84%. Mean Machines, on the other hand, went with an 80% and gave it a high recommendation. Julian argued that although Double Dragon 2 looks a bit rough around the edges, it's great fun to play. The multitude of baddies to bash and the sheer variety of backdrops and weapons make this one stand heads and shoulders above most Nintendo beat-em-ups. I absolutely agree. This is definitely one of the best 8-bit brawlers, and it's leagues better than either the Genesis or the arcade sequel. Give it a play.
Double Dragon 2: The Revenge. Raw power for your NES. 9 incredible missions. 2-player simultaneous action. Double Dragon 2 from Acclaim. The best action game ever.
Once again, we have a home console sequel that veers wildly from the arcade original. While there are elements that tie the NES game back to the Rosetta Stone, Double Dragon 3: The Sacred Stones is an altogether different beast. Marion has been kidnapped by a mysterious organization, and the Lee brothers are forced to travel around the world hunting down a bunch of rocks. Of course, the story isn't all that important, since the only thing that anybody actually remembers about this game is that they accidentally call Billy Lee Bimmy in a couple of cutscenes. Yeah, that's embarrassing, but I would argue that The Sacred Stones has a lot more going for it. Let's see if the critics agree with me. While it may not have been up for consideration for Game of the Year, Electronic Gaming Monthly liked Double Dragon 3 as much as they did the second installment. Giving it a score of 9 out of 10, SushiX concluded that as a true fan of the Double Dragon series, I was blown away by this excellent sequel of sequels. The new moves, cast, and storyline add a whole new dimension to the intense fighting action. Martin wasn't as impressed, giving the game a 7. Double Dragon 3 is another good fighting game that resembles Part 2 in most aspects. Lots of techniques to master before you beat this one. I like the other characters that you change into. Cool graphics and awesome moves kept my interest. EGM ultimately gave this Double Dragon sequel an average score of 8 out of 10. Unfortunately, other critics were not as impressed with the Sacred Stones. Nintendo Power gave the beat-em-up a low score of 3.3 out of 5 in their 23rd issue. Mean Machines wasn't much better, giving the sequel a pitiful score of 65%. Arrgh! I've played this game a lot over the last few months, and it's taken me ages just to get off the first level. I just can't understand why the game's designers chose to make Double Dragon 3 so difficult. A good challenge increases the game's longevity, but this is just so tough that you're instantly put off. It's a shame, really, because this game has the best graphics of the Nintendo Double Dragon series. It also beats its predecessors in terms of depth as well. If you're a die-hard Double Dragon nut who completed the first 2 chapters of the series with incredible ease, I recommend this without hesitation. However, it's just too difficult and frustrating for the average games player. Now, if you're looking for the highest score, then look no further than GamePro. Giving the game a perfect 5 out of 5, they concluded that Double Dragon 3 is one of the toughest street fighting carts around. The graphics won't knock you out, but the fighting definitely will. If you've mastered the first 2 Double Dragon cards, then you must tackle this one too. But be forewarned, the knuckle busting gets pretty dirty. It's the law of the video game jungle. Beat or be beaten. Ooh, while I prefer Double Dragon 2 over the 3rd installment, I gotta say that the Sacred Stones is still worth a play. It's sad. Mean Machines was right. It is tough. So if you get frustrated easily, Double Dragon 3 might not be for you. The early part of the 21st century was not particularly kind to the traditional 2D side-scrolling beat-em-up. This was a genre that was desperately trying to evolve, with companies like Square doing everything in their power to push the old-school brawler into a 3D world with games like The Bouncer. This would eventually lead to the Warriors from Rockstar, God Hand from Capcom, and of course Sega's long-running Yakuza series. While many of those games are a lot of fun, fans of the beat-em-ups that were made famous in the 1980s and 90s were left out, with little more than re-releases of the arcade classics on the Game Boy Advance, such as Final Fight 1 in 2001 and the game that we're going to talk about now, Double Dragon Advance. While I call it a port, the truth is that this 2003 brawler has a lot more going for it. The visuals have been beefed up a bit, the different characters have more moves, and there are even 4 new stages to fight through. That was a big deal to fans of old school beat-em-ups who are not exactly being catered to in 2003. But was this enough to win back critics who had, let's be honest here, given up on the genre a decade ago? Unfortunately, the answer is no. Few magazines covered Double Dragon Advance, and the ones that did weren't especially kind. GamePro gave it a 3.5 out of 5, concluding that graphically, the character animation is much improved. Cutscenes resembling comic book panels have been inserted between levels and offer more detailed portrayals of vanquished enemies, complete with silly dialogue. The authentic 8-bit musical score is a retro treat and may induce nostalgia and giddiness. The fun factor suffers only because of minor problems with the control and collision detection. Nothing hurts more than falling off a ledge that you're sure you're standing on or being hit by someone who you thought was out of range. This is in line with what GMR said back in 2003. They gave it a 6 out of 10, echoing a lot of what GamePro said. Double Dragon betters the look of the beat-em-up franchise that began in 1985, plus adds a few gameplay twists. Purple tights-clad femme fatales and big bald guys named Bobo remain, but Atlas added new moves, new enemies, and new gameplay modes such as a survival and single-player tag team. While nostalgia hounds will likely be amused, others will probably want more depth from the best beat-em-up 1985 has to offer. Look, I'm not trying to be a stickler here, but Double Dragon came out in 1987, not 1985. And while I certainly understand why critics weren't excited for an enhanced version of Double Dragon in 2003, I'd argue that this version is probably better than the scores suggest.
Dragon 3, the ultimate in NES martial arts action continues with all new weapons, characters, and street fighting moves against the world's most awesome villains. Double Dragon 3 from Acclaim. The action keeps coming.
Although there was only a 2-year gap between the release of the last 8-bit Double Dragon game, The Sacred Stones, and Super Double Dragon on the Super Nintendo, a lot has changed in those 2 years. We not only saw the home console release, the arcade smash hit Final Fight, but Sega ended up stealing Capcom's thunder with the critically acclaimed Streets of Rage. Now you would think that the franchise that was largely responsible for popularizing this genre would have no problem picking up where it left off, but Super Double Dragon failed to make the same impact on 16-bit consoles. This was a game that initially found itself overshadowed by the Streets of Rage and Final Fight feud, only to be overshadowed once again by a wave of one-on-one fighting games. Yeah, Super Double Dragon couldn't catch a break. Now, believe it or not, the Super Nintendo Brawler was also one of the most polarizing games of 1992. Based on the magazine reviews, you either thought it was perfect or kinda underwhelming. Let's go ahead and start with the top scores, which included GamePro giving Super Double Dragon a score of 5 out of 5. They were especially impressed with the tight gameplay and diverse levels, arguing that Super Double Dragon is one tough customer. If you like to talk beat-em-up stuff, you've got nothing to say until you beat this cart. Super Double Dragon kicks! Similarly, Die Hard Game Fan was prepared to give the game near-perfect scores. Brody compared it to one of the other games on the market. This is an incredible fighting game that lives up to Streets of Rage fame. The amount of detail and moves in this game are seriously outstanding. Throw in 2-player option plus 16-bit version of Double Dragon tunes and you've got yourself an awesome game. Skip went even higher, noting that if you like fighting games, then this is your game. Double Dragon is definitely the best fighting game for the Super Nintendo. On the flip side of that coin, you saw a lot of critics who were disappointed by Super Double Dragon. N-Force, for example, gave the game a so-so 70%. While Nintendo Power went as low as a 3.2 out of 5. Nestled right in the middle is Super Play, who had a lot of complaints about the presentation. The thing that'll put most people off are the 8-bit graphics. While Super Double Dragon has a couple of attractive sections, there's no denying that it's a pretty poor attempt, with more of a play-it-safe style than anything else. There is some hidden charm here, but I find it hard to justify spending this much money on such a primitive game. It's fun and quite tough for a while, but don't you think the Super Nintendo deserves better? Superplay ultimately gave Super Double Dragon a score of 68%, calling it a waste of money. Look, while there are a lot of 16-bit brawlers that I would rather play, Super Double Dragon deserves a reevaluation. These critics were either way too harsh or not critical enough, with the right answer being somewhere in the middle. It was definitely not the best fighting game of 1992, but it's also nowhere near a waste of money. Huh, funny how that works.
Double Dragon 3, the Rosetta Stone.
Technos.
Hey, thanks for watching me break down these classic reviews. If you liked what you saw here, then you should know that we post new episodes just like this every time old school game compilations come out. We have a whole playlist full of episodes just like this one. Now, here's the question I have for you. What's your favorite Double Dragon game? You know what? There's just something about Double Dragon 2 on the NES that I love, but also Neon is so good. Let me see your picks in the comments below. In other news, we'll be back next week with a review of a rock climbing game and a brand new episode of the Nintendo Switch Online Review Crew. While you wait for that, I strongly recommend you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then.